Hey everyone, my name is Matt Gear and I'm an SE for Cisco Meraki. What I wanted to do was spend some time with you this morning to talk about a module that's been included to CMDS for Catalyst onboarding, right? The concept behind this is that if you have switches in your environment that you want to use for Catalyst monitoring, right? And so again, just to recap, monitoring is the concept of keeping iOS XE on the switch but using iOS XE commands to onboard those switches into the Meraki dashboard so that you can get things like client telemetry, ADC, being able to see the up-down status of the switch, being able to look at diff configs, and being able to now actually manage the iOS XE software from the cloud to the Catalyst switch. That's what that concept is, right? When we look at that concept, uh, there are some requirements that the switch needs to meet to be able to get onboarded into the cloud dashboard, right? There's some things like IP routing that we need to enable, NTP, AAA new model, and we'll talk about that in the document real quick, right? But what this module is designed to do is to do all of that iOS XE prep work for you so that when you actually get to the, when you get to the cloud monitoring for Catalyst application, uh, there are no gotchas, right? So the server will take care of all that iOS XE stuff for you, right? And then when you get to the actual onboarding application, it's just getting the switches onboarded into the dashboard, right? Let me share my screen here. We'll talk about the doc real quick, and then we'll jump into getting these switches prepped so that they can be onboarded. Looking at my screen here, this is the public documentation that's on the Meraki website. This talks about the requirements for the switches themselves, right? So we have a couple models that are supported, 9200s, 9300s, 9500s. And then we also have particular versions of iOS XE that are supported on the switches too, right? And the range is pretty large, right? If you go to the Cisco support site, and we'll see that shortly here, you'll see that 17.12 and 17.9 are the preferred iOS XE versions, one being the early deployment, one being the maintenance deployment for the iOS XE images. So it is a best practice that you choose one of those images and you should move your switches to those image versions, right? Now, when we look at what actually needs to happen from a configuration perspective for the switch, there's a couple things, right? The switch itself needs to talk to some TLS gateways depending on geographically where it's placed. And it does that using the telnet command on port 443. And so that is a requirement on the switching side, is that from the switch's perspective, we do need to allow line VTY outbound, right, to be able to initiate telnet. In addition to that, right, we also need to look at creating a route for the switch. So when we enable IP routing, I like to call it the gateway of last resort, right? So our 00 prefix and destination going to an IP address, right? In the documentation here, you can see that IP default gateway is not enough. When we enable IP routing, we need to have that set, right? IP name servers, right? So if you don't have DNS set up in your environment today, the server will do that for you. We need to make sure that DNS lookup is enabled. We need to make sure that NTP is up and operational and that the switches are synchronized, because the TLS certificates are going to leverage that through the tunnel when the tunnel is created. So we need to have good time synchronization. AAA new model, right? So AAA new model needs to be enabled. And so AAA new model for the switches, we want to make sure that we're enabling IPSSH access for the switches, right? Because that's how the cloud monitoring application is going to talk to these switches. But in addition to that, we also want to make sure that you have good console access so you don't have like an error in authentication, right? And so the server will also fix that up for you also, right? So really more of a set and forget, if you will, right? Once we start going through this process. So with that being said, that's kind of a high level overview of what the requirements are. And so let's actually bring up the application here and we'll start going through this process. So the very first thing that we're going to do is from the main menu here, we're going to select the Catalyst Monitoring for Switching Prep tool, and we are going to run the Setup Wizard. And so the Setup Wizard is going to ask you some questions so that we can get everything up and ready for you for this particular batch of switches. So when I talk about batch of switches real quick, what I mean is that usually the best practices is that, let's say I have multiple subnets of switches based on their management IP address. What I want to do is I want to use only the subnet of switches at a time, right? And especially with this type of implementation, because what we need to do is we need to specify that gateway of last resort, right? So if your switches do not have an IP default gateway statement, which they should, but if they didn't for whatever reason, right, we have to manually intervene there. And so we don't have things stepping on each other. It is a best practice to, do your switches subnet at a time in batches, right? And I'll show you what that looks like as we go through this process. So again, the very first thing that we're going to tell you is these are the recommended versions for the switches. And if you want to, you can actually click on this link here and it'll take you to the software download section. So I'm actually going to take a look at, like, for example, my 9300 switches. Go to iOS XE software. And if I download that, right, as I download, best practices is to take a look at the MD5, right? So we can see the MD5 checksum here, ending in 405B3. What I'm going to do is I've already downloaded those images, so I'm going to go back to my wizard here. I'm going to press enter when ready. And so the first thing we need to do is start uploading these images to the server. Now you can use SCP, FileZilla, whatever program you have. If you want, you can also use the Navigator component that comes built in with the server. And so if I click on that link, that will take us to the CMDS server itself, where I can then log in as root. And that will take us to what's called Navigator. So Navigator is just a web-based UI that will allow you to upload files into particular directories if you would like. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh the page here. So you can see that we need to be in varlib tftp boot images, and we can double check that, right? Varlib tftp boot images. So I'm going to go ahead and click the upload button here, and I'm going to upload 17.12. That's where I want to upgrade to. So I'm going to grab my Cat 9K Lite because I do have a 9200 in the environment, and I'm also going to grab the Cat 9K iOS XE. And so I'm going to upload both of those files via Navigator into the server. So talking about different switch models, right? The 9300s and 9500s use what I'm going to call the full version of iOS XE, and then the 9200s use the light version of iOS XE. And you'll see here when we deploy the image that the server is actually going to disseminate between the 9200 platform and the 9300 platform as it deploys those images for us. Okay, so coming back to the wizard here, I'm going to go ahead and press enter. So the first thing it's going to ask me for is a username to log in. And then it's going to ask me for a password. Then it's going to want the Meraki API key. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that, paste it in there. And now what it's going to do is it's going to go into that directory that we specified, and it's going to list the it's going to list the files, and it's also going to provide the MD5 for that. So if I look here, right, I can see that my Cat iOS XE is 405B3. If I go back to the website, again, 405B3. And if I wanted to, I could do the same thing with my Cat 9200, right? So we'll go ahead and do it just for fun. Go ahead and grab this guy, 1712. That ends in 220AF and 220AF, right? So my checksums match. Now, when I am in an environment where I have multiple models, you can see here that we want you to use the full iOS XE version as our base iOS XE, and then the server will work around introducing light into the environment if it needs to, right? So I'm going to go ahead and just highlight this, copy it, paste it. And here I'm going to go ahead and prep with IP addresses. These are my two switches that I have in the environment, both sitting in the 241 subnet. Just going to go ahead and exit that, and then provide the NTP IP address if we need it for deployment. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in. My DNS also. And then the default gateway. So again, we already touched on this, right? But what the server is going to do is it's going to look at the config of the switch, and it's going to say, do you already have a gateway of last resort, right? If you already do, I'm not going to update it, right? I don't need to, right? So when we're looking at things where maybe we have 9500s that are using layer 3 and are already routing in our core or distribution, right? But if I do have switches that are more layer 2 switches and they just have a management IP address on them and they do have an IP default gateway statement, then the server will see that and it will migrate, if you will, that IP address for the IP default gateway to a gateway of last resort when we enable IP routing. If there is no IP default gateway, then what the server will do is it will take the entry that we just provided it, and it will use that as the gateway of last resort for the switches as they're being deployed. So I'm going to go ahead and put in that IP address here, 192.168.241.1 for that subnet of switches that I had earlier, right? Go ahead and press enter. And so here, now what we have is all of the information that we've put into the server. Lets us review it. Go ahead and press enter. So the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to run a data collection on the switches, and we're going to clean the file system. And all that is that's a inactive file removal, just to make sure that we have a clean environment as we're now interoperating with the switches. Okay, so that is complete. So the next thing we can do is take a look at the iOS XE versions on the switches. And we can see that right now we're sitting at 17.09.05. As I mentioned earlier, right, I want to upgrade these to 17.12. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to deploy the iOS XE image. Now I can do this interactively with this screen right here, but the other thing that you can also do is you can schedule these deployments as you would like. So maybe if you wanted to do this after hours in lower network utilization, you could schedule it up to deploy the image at, we'll say, midnight or 1 a.m., right? So I'm going to go ahead and interactively deploy the iOS XE image right here. And so what you can see is the server sees that the first switch with the IP address 241.42 is a 9300 or 9500. And so it's going to deploy the full iOS XE image. You can see down here that it is using Cat9K iOS XE, not the light version of iOS XE. So while this is downloading, I'm going to go ahead and pause the video to save us some time. And I'll let you guys see when we move on to the 9200 that it's going to be using the light version, right? So I'll see you guys shortly. Okay, guys, so again, I just wanted to show you real quick, right? The server detected that the next switch is a 9200 series in the process here, and it's deploying the iOS XE Lite image. And we can see that with the raw output down here that we are deploying cat9k _ light _ iOS XE, right? So, you know, if you have a hybrid environment where you have multiple models of switches and you're looking to do an iOS XE image deployment on them, the server will be able to do that for you, right? Okay, so we'll go ahead and let this finish up, and then the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to actually install this iOS XE image as an upgrade to the switches, and then we'll actually get to the sanity checks for the Meraki deployment. So we'll see you guys shortly. Okay, guys, so we are back. So we successfully deployed the image to the switches, right? So we got it downloaded. And so the next thing I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to open up a separate window, and I'm going to log into the server again. And the reason that I'm going to do that is that there is a tool that allows us to ping the IP addresses in the batches that we have. So if I come down to utilities here, I'm going to run a ping sweep on the active switches. And so what that's going to allow me to do is see the IP addresses that are in the batch that I created, which are these two switches here, right? And it's going to allow me to see their up-down status as I'm upgrading the iOS XE on those switches themselves. So that's the very next thing that we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and upgrade iOS XE on these switches, right? So you can see here that what the server is going to do is it's going to start the install process, and once it gets to a commit level from the switch, it'll go ahead and move on to the next switch. So while this is working through, I'm going to go ahead and pause the video again just to save us some time. And then once this is complete, we'll go ahead and get started on actually validating the config and getting the onboarding component for cloud monitoring. Okay, see you guys shortly. Okay, guys, so I just wanted to show you real quick that on the monitoring here, we can see that the switches are starting to go down, and it reflects that with the red down. So both of these switches are going to go down, and then they'll come back up, and then we'll go ahead and continue with the Meraki check. Okay, just wanted to show that to you real quick. Okay, guys, so we are back. So we officially upgraded our switches to 17.12. Both of them are now up and green again. And so what we can do to validate that is if we want to run the iOS XE version check one more time, we can have the server go out and collect the latest information on them. And we can see that they're both running at 17.12.03, right? So now we get into actually running the sanity checks so that we can get these onboarded into the Meraki dashboard. And again, this is purely from an iOS XE perspective, right? So I'm going to go ahead and start the script here. And again, you know, we reviewed the documentation earlier as far as what the requirements were. And so we're going to see that the server is going to, again, go out to each of these switches, collect the latest information on them, and then it's going to use some logic to validate what's good and what's bad on the switches. So the first thing that we can see here is that the first switch install mode is good. It meets the minimum requirement for iOS XE, right? We can see the telnet is allowed for the VTY output, but NTP, there's a problem. DNS, because it's statically assigned, has a problem. AAA new model has a problem. And as it's going through, it's attempting to correct all of the issues that it runs into. Now, the last thing that you can see is that it tries to go out and ping google.com via name resolution, right? So it at least validates that we have layer 3 routing that was updated and then DNS resolution, right? And so you can see that it's going through and doing the same thing with the next switch. And so, like, for example, you can see there it says that the VTY was not allowed for outbound telnet, right? So it's going in there and it's fixing that VTY for us. And again, as it goes through this process, as it's looking at the network stack, it goes to ping Google and it sees that it gets a result of 100%. So that's good. However, the switches did not pass all the checks, right? Because it had to go in and it had to fix some things. So what we should do after we run the script once is we should run the script again to validate that everything is coming back green. So we're going to go ahead and do that now. So before I do that, right, if we want to, if you go down to logs, you can actually take a look at the Meraki pre-check. And what it does is it will provide you all of the raw information, but then it will also reproduce what we saw, right? So from a switching perspective, right, you can review anything that you may have run into, and you can see what it did, right? So let's rerun the script one more time. And this time we should get all green results. Okay, so everything is looking good. Everything is green. What it does is it then commits the changes to the switches, right? You may have saw that on the last script run. But at the bottom here, we should see that all requirements are met for Meraki onboarding. So that's good. So what that means is that we can now continue with the next step, which is the final step, which is actually getting the switches onboarded into an environment. So what we can do is come down to the download cloud monitoring for Catalyst application. And what that allows us to do is directly download from these links, whether you're running Windows, Mac, or Linux. But then the server also provides your API key, and it provides the switches that we onboard or that we prepped for onboarding, right? So to save us some time here, I already have the cloud monitoring for Catalyst installed on my system. And so I'll bring that application up here. Okay, so to log into the dashboard or to log in, we need to provide the API key. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here because my API key is associated to a couple different organizations. So for their anonymity, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. But literally what I would do here is I'm going to grab my API key here, I'm going to copy it, paste it, and then press the start button. And so it says that I successfully logged in. And then what it allows you to do is choose the organization that you want to onboard these switches into. Okay. So I'm just choosing my org, Matt here, and I'm clicking next. And let me go ahead and reshare my screen. Okay. So here, this is where we enter the switch IPs. And again, from the prep perspective, you can just copy those out from the list that's over here. I can go ahead and paste those right here. And then I'm probably going to be using the same privilege 15 user that I used to log in via CMDS to these switches. Do that one more time. Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead and click next. And then we'll go ahead and start the SSH, and those authenticated successfully. Go ahead and click next and start the pre-check. And so from this perspective, right, everything is going to pass because of the work that the server did for us earlier, right? So, you know, our DNS entries, our AAA new model, our NTP, all that fun stuff, right? So these two switches are ready for onboarding. I'm going to go ahead and select a network that I want to use here. Go ahead and use 03 desk. Click next. Over here, select them, click next, save. And so now they are being onboarded into the Meraki dashboard. Okay. So while that is working, let's go back to CMDS. Go ahead and press enter here. And so the last thing that we need to do is we need to run a batch cleanup. And so what a batch cleanup does is it takes any of the logging information that the server has up to this point in time, and it archives it into the root directory. And so the benefit to that is that you have historical information of all transactions that happened on the switches if you needed to. And it also provides you a configuration, if you will, from the changes that were made. So when I run this batch cleanup, it's just going to ask me if I want to go ahead and proceed and say yes. And so with the batch cleanup, The other thing that it does is it clears our IP addresses that we used in our batch, right? So when we used the setup wizard, you saw that there were some IP addresses for management IPs, right? So those are now gone. But what the batch cleanup does leave in place is the iOS XE code, right? So the benefit to that is you don't have to rerun the setup wizard if you don't want to. You can if you want, but you don't have to. So if I wanted to run my next batch, all I would have to do is go to my global environment settings, and I would update my batch IP addresses, right? And so this probably looks familiar. So I could then do something like this, right? And put my next set of IP addresses into the server for processing. So I'll go ahead and save that. Now, the one last thing I want to point out, right, is when we ran the setup wizard, right, we had to specify a gateway of last resort if everything else failed, right? If the switches did not have an IP default gateway statement, we couldn't convert that. We had to have a user intervention there to make that happen. So right now, right, the gateway is sitting at our old address, right? But if you notice, I put a new subnet in for our next set of switches, right? So what you can do is you can come down here to your utilities, and you can deploy a global default route. And so my new global default route is going to be that new IP address in that subnet, right? So we could say it's 245.1. And so at this point, we've updated that setting, right? Now, it asks if we want to deploy it. And here I'm going to say no, we don't want to deploy it. And it brings us back to the menu. So if you notice, all of the functions that were in the script that we ran are here under the utilities. And so you can run all of these utilities as one-offs, right? So let's say you wanted to add a different NTP server, but you didn't want to leverage the script because you already ran it, or you wanted to do some manual prepping for whatever reason. You can use all of the options right here as one-offs to be able to deploy them across globally, meaning any IP address that is in that batch list that we were running, right? So hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so let's go back to the onboarding, and we can see that the device is connected successfully. So I'm going to come down here to my Meraki dashboard, and I'm going to go ahead and go into that network. And now we can see that we have two switches in here, right? One switch is still being onboarded, but it looks like the other one is up and running. So we can take a peek at that guy. And we can see that it's showing its static IP address. And we can see that, obviously the dashboard has pulled in the configuration for that switch, right? So if you have further questions or you want to know more about Catalyst monitoring in general, check out my other video that I have. But from this perspective, we are done, right? So we have successfully upgraded our iOS XE. We ran all the sanity checks for the Meraki deployment on the iOS XE side. And then we used the cloud monitoring application to get these switches onboarded into the Meraki dashboard. So I do appreciate your time. I hope this was a good use of your time. It was informational. If you think you can use this in your environment, download it, give it a shot. Definitely has been fully tested, regression tested also, so it should be good to go. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out, okay? So wherever you're watching this, whether it's in the morning, afternoon, or evening, I definitely appreciate your time. Thank you, and definitely come back for future videos. Hope you have a great day. Take care.